Charlie Wiley with us now, long-time commentator, reporter, lecturer, still connects with kids all over the country, goes to colleges. Charlie, great to have you again.
Well, it's always good to talk to you. And what you said about the kids, the basic was you just kind of said it there at the end. We used to have fun. I mean, everybody had fun. We worked hard and we had fun. And I had the same formula when I organized things like the National Committee for Responsible Patriotism, which put on some of the biggest activities in the history of this country. Among other things, we put on the third longest parade that's ever happened. Imagine a parade lasting almost 9 hours with 250,000 people in it. We used to have a volunteer staff of people, and we created miracles in a sense. I mean, we from a standing start, we would put on these activities, and the idea was everybody had fun. When you came to the headquarters, everybody came up there, and they worked like hell, but they worked like hell at the same time. That there were kids around, and everybody had a great sense of humor, and I think that's a big part of it. And I think probably some of the older people that are trying to motivate these young people, they skip that part, and or maybe they never knew about it to begin with, and so there's a kind of a secret to it all.
Well, but you're right. You have to have fun, and you were surrounded. You were older, obviously, in your 50s, and you were surrounded by all these kids. I was one of them back in the day, or you in your 40s, I guess. But you had all these kids, and they were all in high school. I mean, we're all in high school or first year college or community college and things like that. We'd all gather to work on your campaign. It was a lot of fun. And then, but the thing that you did that made that engaged everybody is that, and I just got to tell this quick story. We'd be working on the campaign, all in Charlie's house. It'd be like 15 of us, and then in would come the RNC guy, right? That the Republican National Committee operative would come in, and Charlie would spend the entire time making fun of them. And so we would laugh our tails off because it was all true. They were like pompous guys from the RNC, and they thought they knew everything. And you had to hear all these kids, and Charlie would spend the entire time making fun of them. And so we would laugh. Remember that? You had some guy.
Oh yeah.
They're all dead now, but they'd come in and your campaign manager from the RNC and March Miller and these guys.
When you were talking about my run, and I ran in 76 and 78. And I came in 78. I came within a very few votes of pulling the biggest upset in the country.
100 votes.
And then they took away the nomination from me in 80 when I went up breezed in.
Yep.
And because of what you said, my kidding these guys, but it was more than that. They knew. They found out a terrible secret. They found out that I was going to take my own staff with me to Washington.
That's right.
And once they knew that I wasn't going to give jobs to all their guys and let them run my office and, in effect, run me, that's when they managed to pull it. We won't go into the story, but it was an incredible operation in which suddenly at a major convention with hundreds of people, they suddenly announced this convention isn't going to happen tonight. We found out that it would be illegal.
On the afternoon of the convention, and we had organized this thing, and they're still doing the same corrupt things now that the RNC's been doing forever. But at 3:00 in the afternoon of the night, the convention was at night. We used to have them at night. At the night of the convention, they cancel it because we were going to win the convention 9-1. I mean, we had thousands of people signed up for that were already waiting there. I mean, that's how we had your signs up. We had signs like directing people in for miles, and we were going to beat them 8 or 9-1. So they cancel it, go to a primary, get donors to dump in, outspend us 8-1, bury us on the ballot. And we still almost beat them, but that was it. And they did that because you said you were going to bring all of these young people up, including me, to go work in your campaign office in Washington. It was so funny back then. Too much.
Sad story about how the system works. And unfortunately, like you said, it still is a corrupt system down there in which they kind of feed each other. It just goes on and on, and it's bad. By the way, it's in both parties, obviously, but that's for another story. Today, I've been looking over the original information about masks. Everybody's talking about masks now, whether you shouldn't. Oh my God, if you don't wear a mask, you're supposed to be shot at dawn. And they go on a diatribe about we got to have to pass draconian laws to make people wear the mask. What's the matter? Why don't they listen to the science? And so I don't know, just for the hell of it, I did a little research here a couple days ago about the original information that we were given about masks. And it's unbelievable. The World Health Organization, our own health organizations, our own leaders in science, if you want, the scientific advice was overwhelmingly, don't wear a mask. And this was in January, February, March, April. They started to churn it around, and by May, and as it said in one article I read, this is one of the greatest turnarounds in history. Suddenly, instead of telling you shouldn't wear them, they're telling you've got to wear them. And so when one of the things that I look at is what the position was that we were in when we first were hit by this thing. And because of what the situation was, I've never been critical of the leaders of any country, of any state, of any city for making mistakes. We had a brand new problem. We had a new disease. We didn't know much about it. And so, to give all this condemnation, they made this mistake, they made that mistake, they did this, I will not join in that against anybody on either side, with a single exception. And the one exception to me is the perfect example of where governments do not work. And it's just a shame. Because of all the information that we had, all the contradictory information that we had, and that's why you can't blame the leadership for making mistakes, because they were given information that was incorrect in many cases. But the one thing everybody agreed on, we must protect the most vulnerable people, primarily the older people who had illnesses of one kind and another, especially, but just in general, people that were over 65. Mm-hmm. Everybody agreed that that was the one thing that we all must do above all. And so, while I won't blame them for any other mistakes they made, those people who were in charge of cities, of states, of countries, whatever, when they did not go out and do that. Now, in our country, the authority falls on the people at the state level, and then they pass it on down. We don't have the kind of a national level leadership that they have in other countries when they have these kind of things. But in Italy and in Spain and in these countries where the orders came from the very top, and in our country when they came from the various governors and so on and down the line, they didn't do the one thing that they all agreed was absolutely necessary. They did not take care of the most vulnerable people. And in fact, in many cases, they put them into a death sentence by putting them in the same places as the people that already had the disease. And so you ended up just decimating the older people and the people that are vulnerable. And I do not say that because I'm almost 94. I took care of myself. I hunkered down and just kept away from the world pretty much, and so on. So it's nothing personal, but it is it's such a great example or terrible example of where government fails. I can't understand when these people sat down and say, what are we going to do about this thing? We really don't know much about it. But, we do know that you're supposed to protect the old people. So now the first thing we have to do is how do we get the old people away from people that will give them the disease?
So, look, even if you look at New York, and he just got away with this. I mean, Governor Cuomo put all these people that had COVID into nursing homes, wiping out tens of thousands of aged people, and he got away with it. Like, the media never asked him a question. The fake news never held him accountable. Now he's got a book out. He's got a daily TV show, and the guy sentenced thousands of people to death, and no one asked a question.
No, that's the problem. The news media stopped doing its job. I was giving lectures about the news media slanting the news, and when I look at the way they slanted it in those days, you have to point out to people, and the real slanting of news in what was legitimate news. We always had slanted news in the tabloid press and the Hearst press and but everybody knew it. But then, starting in the 1950s, it started to move where in the mainstream media, where up until then you were getting objective news by and large. If you were in New York City, if you wanted news, you got the New York Times or the New York Herald Tribune. And if you wanted all the scandal stories, and if you wanted slanted news about politics, you bought a Hearst newspaper, one of the tabloids maybe, and you knew what you were getting. Mm-hmm. But starting in the 50s, the mainstream media started to edge in a little bit of slanted news at a time. And at the beginning, the things they would do would be so minor compared to now. But if the Dewey wing of the Republican Party, the East Coast crowd that controlled the Republican Party, if they won a primary or if they had some political victory somewhere, it would be on the front page. Mm-hmm. And if the people from the Taft wing of the party in the Midwest primarily, if they won something, it would be on page 16 under the Macy ad. and that was how it started. That was as far as it went. The stories themselves, by and large, were objective stories. And so people like myself that went to New York University Journalism School, where we were taught our trade by journalists, we were doing our job. Mm-hmm. And that was the overwhelming majority. But then this little kind of cutie thing started cropping up. I started warning about that in the late 1950s. By the 60s, it had started to move forward. And now you were getting more and more slanted stories, and slanted now openly almost, because the slanting started to become obvious in some cases. And then you had people in the news media pointing it out. And there were a lot of big-name people that were pointing out that the news media was overwhelmingly, at that point, liberal. And if you go to the elections of those times, any kind of survey of media people found that they were voting 8-1 or 10-1 in favor usually of liberal candidates, which meant the Democratic Party overwhelmingly. And then after a while, it just became so outrageous that there's no news in the fact that the news media is slanted. I think everybody that reads the news or listens to the news, watches the news, I think that if you're really interested in those kind of things, they slant.
Well, now it's openly and defiant. Now it's the fake news, and they have an agenda that they're going to carry out. But if you really trace this back, if you want to trace it back in history, as a student of journalism and being in the business for so long for myself, I really thought that it started with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which was a overwhelming victory for the American forces in Vietnam. If you study the Tet Offensive, I mean, it was a complete Viet Cong failure at every level. And yet it was played in America by the anti-Vietnam War media. It was played as this great defeat at the hands of the Viet Cong. Charlie, and if you really trace it back, that was the first time where news was manipulated both in print and on television in such a way to portray an exact fake account of what happened.
Opposite. I was covering the war. I was in Vietnam for the Tet Offensive, and I went from one end of that country to the other. You couldn't have covered more of it than I did. I was out on combat missions in airplanes. I was out on a carrier for a couple days watching the operations offshore. I helicoptered into the biggest battle of the war, which was at Way City and so on. And so I knew the war. And they used to fly kinescopes to us. In those days, you couldn't send things over directly, so they used to send actual copies. And so the reporters were able to look at what was being shown on the American television, but it was coming in late, obviously, days and days after the event. When I first saw what was being shown to the American people, I mean, my mouth dropped open. It was just mind-boggling. I was out there watching us kick the hell out of them and winning overwhelmingly. And here the American people were being told just the opposite. And incidentally, there's no question about whether or not we won. The commander-in-chief of the opposing forces has openly said that they lost the battle on the battlefield, but it didn't make any difference, he said, because we won the propaganda battle in the United States.
Unbelievable. And you can really trace it back to the Tet Offensive and the way that was reported.
Right, you got it right. That's when it started. Hit the pinnacle.
Right. Well, that's when it became okay to change the truth in order to advance an agenda. And the agenda of the U.S. media then was to get us out of the Vietnam War. That was the agenda. And so they simply changed the facts and reported something the exact opposite of what happened, which was a major U.S. victory and a tremendous failure of the Viet Cong forces on the Tet Offensive. And if you read history books today, it's still wrong. Charlie, I gotta go. John Fredericks Radio Network. We love you, man. We'll see you next week. Charlie Wiley, good to have you.